The desert heat pressed down like a heavy blanket as Sergeant Maria Gonzalez adjusted the medical pack on her shoulders. Sweat had long since soaked through her uniform, but she barely noticed anymore. After 18 months in Afghanistan, the oppressive heat had become just another part of the landscape, like the endless stretches of sand and rock that surrounded Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Maria wiped her forehead with the back of her gloved hand and checked her watch. The patrol would be moving out in 20 minutes, and she wanted to double-check her supplies one more time. As the unit's primary field medic, she carried the weight of every soldier's life in her pack. Each bandage, each vial of morphine, each tourniquet could mean the difference between a soldier making it home or being shipped back in a flag-draped coffin. She had joined the Army 4 years earlier, straight out of high school in El Paso, Texas. Her mother had cried when she signed the papers, begging her to consider nursing school instead, but Maria had always felt called to serve. And the promise of medical training while serving her country seemed like the perfect path. She had excelled in her training at Fort Sam Houston, earning top marks in battlefield medicine and emergency trauma care. Now, as she methodically inventoried her supplies, Maria reflected on how much she had changed since those early days. The eager 18-year-old who had raised her hand to take the oath had been replaced by a seasoned combat medic who had seen things that would haunt her dreams for years to come. She had saved lives under fire, held dying soldiers in her arms, and learned to compartmentalize the horror in order to function. Captain James Morrison approached her position near the motor pool, his boots crunching on the gravel. At 32, Morrison was old enough to command respect but young enough to relate to his soldiers. He had been leading Alpha Company for 8 months, and Maria had developed a deep respect for the man. Unlike some officers who led from the rear, Morrison was always at the front when things got dangerous. "Gonzalez, you ready for this?" Morrison asked, adjusting his own gear. The captain carried himself with the confident ease of a soldier who had earned his rank through combat experience rather than politics. His dark eyes showed the strain of command, but also a fierce determination to bring all his soldiers home safely. "Always ready, sir," Maria replied, securing the last of her medical supplies. "Weather report says it's going to be another scorcher." But the intel briefing was solid. Should be a routine patrol to check on the village and establish contact with the local elder. Morrison nodded, but Maria could see something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced this would be routine. Intelligence reports in this part of Helmand Province had been spotty lately, with increasing Taliban activity in the surrounding hills. The local population had grown more nervous in recent weeks, with fewer people willing to provide information about insurgent movements. "Remember, we're going in light and fast," Morrison said, looking toward the assembled patrol. 12 soldiers, 2 vehicles, in and out in 4 hours maximum. The village elder requested this meeting specifically, saying he has information about IED placements along Route Silver. Could save a lot of lives if the intel is good. The first it all off, Maria shouldered her pack and fell in with the rest of the patrol as they moved toward the waiting vehicles. She knew each of these soldiers by name, had treated most of them for various injuries over the past months. There was Private Johnson, barely 20 years old, who still got nervous before every patrol but never showed it to his fellow soldiers. Sergeant Rodriguez had been in country for almost 3 years and served as the patrol's unofficial comedian, always ready with a joke to break tension. Corporal Williams operated the squad automatic weapon and took his responsibility seriously, knowing that his firepower might be the difference between life and death for the entire patrol. Private First Class Chen served as the team's radio operator, maintaining constant communication with base operations. Each soldier had a role, and Maria's role was to keep them all breathing. The mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, or MRAPs, sat waiting in the morning sun like metal fortresses on wheels. These massive armored trucks had saved countless lives since their introduction. Their V-shaped hulls designed to deflect the blast from improvised explosive devices upward and away from the crew compartment. Maria climbed into the second vehicle, taking her position where she could quickly respond to casualties in either truck. As the convoy rolled through the main gate of FOB Phoenix, Maria watched the familiar landscape pass by through the thick armored glass. The countryside here was surprisingly green in places, irrigated fields creating pockets of life in the otherwise harsh environment. Farmers worked their crops in the early morning hours, trying to finish their work before the heat became unbearable. The village of Karez-i-Naw sat about 12 kilometers from the base, connected by a dirt road that had been cleared of IEDs just the week before. The route took them through a valley flanked by low hills covered in loose rock and sparse vegetation. It was classic ambush terrain, with countless hiding spots for insurgents to observe coalition movements. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio from the lead vehicle. "All stations. We're approaching the first checkpoint. Everyone, stay alert. Remember, we're here to build relationships with the locals, but keep your heads on a swivel." Maria checked her weapon one more time, ensuring a round was chambered and the safety was engaged. As a medic, her primary weapon was her medical knowledge and supplies, but every soldier in Afghanistan carried a rifle and knew how to use it. The M4 carbine was lightweight and reliable, though Maria hoped she wouldn't need to fire it today. The village appeared ahead of them, a collection of mud brick buildings clustered around a central area where a few shops and a small mosque dominated the landscape. Children began appearing along the roadside, some waving at the American soldiers while others maintained the suspicious distance that had become common in recent months. As the convoy entered the village center, Maria noted the absence of military-age males. This was often a bad sign, suggesting that local men had been warned to stay away from the area. The intelligence briefing had mentioned increased Taliban recruitment in the region, with growing pressure on local families to support the insurgency. The vehicles stopped near the mosque where the village elder had agreed to meet them. Morrison stepped out of the lead vehicle, immediately beginning to scan the surrounding buildings for potential threats. The rest of the patrol established a defensive perimeter, with soldiers positioned to cover all approaches to their location. Maria remained in her vehicle initially, observing the scene through her window. She could see women and children watching from doorways and windows, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. The presence of American soldiers always created tension in these small communities, caught between cooperation with coalition forces and fear of Taliban retaliation. An elderly man emerged from the mosque, his white beard and traditional robes marking him as the village elder they had come to meet. He approached Morrison with measured steps, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. The two men began speaking through an interpreter. Their conversation focused on the security situation in the surrounding area. As the meeting progressed, Maria noticed movement in the hills surrounding the village. It was subtle at first, just shadows shifting among the rocks. But her trained eye caught the signs of human presence. She reached for her radio to alert Morrison, but before she could speak, the first shot rang out across the valley. The bullet struck the ground near Morrison's feet, sending up a small cloud of dust and instantly transforming the peaceful village scene into a combat zone. Maria immediately began scanning for wounded soldiers while simultaneously looking for cover and concealment. The distinctive crack of an AK-47 echoed off the surrounding hills, followed quickly by the deeper sound of a larger caliber weapon. "Contact! Contact!" Morrison shouted into his radio as he dove for cover behind a low wall. "We're taking fire from multiple positions in the hills to the north and east. Request immediate air support." The patrol responded with trained precision, each soldier moving to predetermined positions and returning fire toward the muzzle flashes visible in the rocky terrain. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets as villagers fled to the safety of their homes, mothers clutching children as they ran for cover. Maria remained in her vehicle momentarily, assessing the tactical situation while preparing her medical supplies for what was likely to be a long engagement. Through her radio, she could hear reports from each position as soldiers identified targets and coordinated their response. The ambush had been well planned, with insurgent positions covering all the main approaches to the village. Sergeant Rodriguez called out from his position behind the second MRAP. "I count at least 6 muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. They've got us in a crossfire pattern." The incoming fire was accurate and sustained, suggesting that the ambush had been carefully prepared with range cards and predetermined fields of fire. Bullets struck the armored vehicles with metallic impacts, while others kicked up dirt and stone fragments throughout the area. The insurgents had chosen their moment well, catching the patrol in an open area with limited cover. Morrison continued directing the response while trying to move his soldiers to more defensible positions. The village layout worked against them, with narrow alleys and flat-roofed buildings that could conceal additional threats. Every doorway and window became a potential firing position that had to be cleared and monitored. "Gonzalez, stay ready," Morrison called out between bursts of return fire. "We may have casualties any minute." Maria acknowledged the order while conducting her own assessment of the battlefield. She identified several positions where wounded soldiers could be treated with some protection from enemy fire, and began planning movement routes that would allow her to reach casualties quickly while minimizing her exposure to incoming rounds. The firefight continued to intensify as more insurgent weapons joined the engagement. The distinctive sound of a PKM machine gun added its voice to the chorus of gunfire, its heavier bullets capable of penetrating the lighter cover that protected some of the patrol positions. Maria could see bullets striking the wall where Morrison had taken cover, steadily chipping away at his protection. Private Johnson called out from his position, "Captain, I see movement in the building to your left." Morrison turned to look just as an insurgent appeared in a second-story window, raising an RPG launcher to his shoulder. The rocket-propelled grenade could destroy the vehicles and kill or wound multiple soldiers with a single shot. Morrison immediately began moving to engage the new threat, but his position left him exposed to fire from multiple directions. The RPG streaked across the village square, missing the lead MRAP by mere feet and exploding against the wall of a nearby building. The blast threw debris in all directions and temporarily deafened everyone in the immediate area. Maria felt the concussion wave even inside her armored vehicle, and she knew that the insurgents were escalating their attacks. As the dust began to settle from the RPG explosion, Maria saw Morrison stumble and fall behind his cover. Even from her position, she could see the dark stain spreading across his uniform and knew that her commanding officer had been wounded. The patrol's medic training kicked in automatically as she assessed the situation and began planning her response. The firefight showed no signs of ending, with sustained gunfire coming from at least 3 different positions in the surrounding hills. Air support was still minutes away, and the patrol was pinned down in an increasingly dangerous position. Maria knew that Morrison's wound could be fatal without immediate medical attention, but reaching him would require crossing open ground under enemy fire. She grabbed her medical pack and prepared to leave the relative safety of the armored vehicle. This was the moment that would define not only Morrison's survival, but her own understanding of courage and duty under fire. The training scenarios and combat exercises had not fully prepared her for the reality of choosing between personal safety and saving a life. The sound of gunfire continued to echo through the village as Maria took a deep breath and prepared to sprint across the killing zone toward her wounded commander. Maria threw open the heavy armored door of the MRAP and immediately felt the intensity of the firefight wash over her like a physical force. The sound of bullets cracking through the air mixed with the deeper reports of rifles and the staccato burst of automatic weapons. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it difficult to see more than 50 meters in any direction. She pressed herself against the side of the vehicle for a moment, gathering her courage and plotting the fastest route to Morrison's position. The captain lay behind a low stone wall, about 30 meters away, but those 30 meters might as well have been 30 miles, given the amount of gunfire crossing the open space between them. Bullets struck the ground near her feet, sending up small geysers of dirt and rock fragments. The insurgents had spotted her movement and were already adjusting their fire to pin her down before she could reach the wounded officer. Maria could see Morrison trying to apply pressure to his wound with one hand, while still attempting to direct the patrol's response with his radio in the other. "Covering fire for the medic," Sergeant Rodriguez shouted from his position behind a concrete barrier. Immediately, the patrol's return fire intensified, forcing the insurgents to take cover and temporarily reducing the accuracy of their shooting. The squad automatic weapon opened up with sustained bursts, its heavier bullets striking the rocky hillside where muzzle flashes had been visible. Maria seized the moment and sprinted across the open ground, her medical pack bouncing heavily on her back with each step. Time seemed to slow as she ran, her focus narrowing to the simple goal of reaching Morrison alive. She could hear bullets passing close by, but forced herself to maintain course rather than zigzag, which would only slow her down. She slid into cover beside Morrison just as a fresh burst of gunfire raked the area where she had been running seconds before. Her hands were already reaching for her medical supplies before she had fully come to a stop, muscle memory from countless training exercises taking over despite the chaos surrounding them. "How bad is it, sir?" Maria asked while cutting away Morrison's uniform sleeve to access the wound. Blood was seeping through his fingers where he pressed against his upper arm, but the flow didn't appear arterial. She could see the entry wound clearly now. A small, dark hole about 2 inches below his shoulder. "Took one in the arm," Morrison replied through gritted teeth, his face pale from shock and blood loss. "Feels like it hit bone. Can you patch me up enough to keep fighting? We need every rifle we can get right now." Maria quickly assessed the wound while keeping one eye on the tactical situation around them. The bullet had passed through the flesh of Morrison's upper arm without hitting the major artery, but bone fragments suggested it had indeed struck his humerus. Without proper surgical care, the arm would be useless for precise shooting, but he might still be able to function with appropriate pain management. "Sir, you're going to need surgery to properly fix this," Maria said while applying a pressure bandage to control the bleeding. "But I can stabilize it enough for you to use a sidearm if necessary. You won't be operating a rifle effectively with this injury." She worked quickly but methodically, her training allowing her to block out the sound of gunfire while focusing on the immediate medical needs. The bandage went on tight, followed by a splint improvised from materials in her pack to immobilize the fractured bone. Morrison winced as she secured the splint, but nodded his approval as she worked. Another RPG streaked across the village center, this time impacting much closer to their position. The explosion threw dirt and debris over their protective wall, and Maria could feel the heat of the blast on her exposed skin. Shrapnel peppered the area around them, emphasizing how precarious their situation had become. "Status report." Morrison called into his radio while Maria administered a morphine injection to manage his pain. "How are we doing on ammunition? And where is that air support?" The responses crackled back over the radio, painting a picture of a patrol that was holding its ground but rapidly consuming its ammunition reserves. Private Johnson reported that he was down to his last 2 magazines. Corporal Williams had been forced to change the barrel on his squad automatic weapon due to overheating from sustained fire. "Air support is still 8 minutes out," came the reply from base operations. "Apache gunships are inbound, but they're coming from a different sector. Hold your positions and mark your perimeter with smoke when they arrive." 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours in their current situation. Maria could see that several soldiers were running low on ammunition, and the insurgent fire showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, more weapons seemed to be joining the fight as additional Taliban fighters arrived to reinforce the ambush. Morrison tried to shoulder his rifle with his wounded arm, but immediately dropped it as pain shot through the injured limb. The splint and bandage were doing their job of stabilizing the fracture, but the damage was too extensive for him to effectively engage targets with a long weapon. He drew his sidearm instead, a 9mm pistol that he could operate one-handed if necessary. "Gonzalez, I need you to take my rifle," Morrison said, indicating the M4 carbine that lay beside him. "You're going to have to help maintain our rate of fire until air support arrives. Can you handle that?" Maria looked at the rifle, her mind racing through the implications of what Morrison was asking. As a medic, her primary duty was to provide medical care to wounded soldiers, not to engage in direct combat with the enemy. But their situation had deteriorated to the point where every person capable of fighting might make the difference between survival and being overrun. She picked up Morrison's rifle and quickly checked the chamber and magazine. The weapon was clean and well maintained, with a full 30-round magazine and 1 round already chambered. The optic sight was zeroed for Morrison's shooting style, but at the ranges they were engaging, it would be accurate enough for her needs. "Sir, I've never been in a firefight like this," Maria admitted, while adjusting the rifle's sling for her smaller frame. "I qualified expert on the range, but this is different." "You'll do fine," Morrison replied, his voice showing the effects of the morphine but still steady and commanding. "Just pick your targets carefully and make every shot count. Remember your breathing and trigger control. The fundamentals are the same whether you're on the range or in combat." A Taliban fighter appeared briefly in a window across the square, and Maria instinctively raised the rifle and acquired the target through her sight. For a split second, she hesitated, the reality of taking another human life weighing heavily on her mind. Then she remembered the wounded soldiers depending on her medical care, and the knowledge that these insurgents were trying to kill her fellow Americans. She squeezed the trigger smoothly, just as she had been taught during countless hours of marksmanship training. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she watched through the sight as the insurgent fell backward out of view. Whether she had scored a hit or simply forced him to take cover, the enemy position fell silent. "Good shot," Morrison said, observing her technique. "Trust your training and keep engaging targets of opportunity. The more pressure we can put on them, the better our chances of surviving until air support arrives." Maria settled into a steady firing rhythm, carefully selecting targets and conserving ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire on the enemy positions. The M4 felt familiar in her hands despite the combat environment, and her shooting remained accurate even under the stress of battle. Years of military training were paying off as muscle memory took over. The insurgent fire began to shift, with several weapons now targeting their position specifically after her successful engagement. Bullets struck the stone wall with increasing frequency, and Maria could see chips of rock flying off their protective barrier with each impact. The enemy was recognizing the new threat and adjusting their tactics accordingly. "We need to move," Morrison said, grimacing as he shifted his wounded arm. "They're zeroing in on this position. Can you help me displace to that building over there?" Maria looked toward the structure Morrison indicated, a single-story building about 20 meters away that would provide better cover from the enemy fire. Moving Morrison with his injury would be challenging, especially while maintaining their defensive fire. But staying in their current position was becoming untenable. She slung Morrison's rifle across her back while keeping her own weapon ready, then helped the captain to his feet. His face showed the strain of moving with his injuries, but he remained determined to reach the new position. Together, they prepared to make the dangerous movement across open ground. Sergeant Rodriguez had been monitoring their situation and immediately understood their intention. "Covering fire for the captain and medic," he called out. And once again, the patrol's weapons opened up with sustained fire to suppress the enemy positions. Maria and Morrison moved together, with Maria providing support for the wounded officer while scanning for immediate threats. Halfway to their destination, she spotted movement on a rooftop that the covering fire had missed. An insurgent was raising his rifle to engage them during their vulnerable movement. Without breaking stride, Maria brought her rifle to bear and fired 2 quick shots at the rooftop position. The insurgent dropped out of sight, and she couldn't tell if she had hit him or simply forced him to take cover, but their movement continued uninterrupted. They reached the relative safety of the building just as a sustained burst of gunfire swept across their former position. The stone wall where they had been sheltering was now taking heavy damage, with large sections beginning to crumble under the impact of bullets and grenade fragments. "Outstanding movement," Morrison said as they settled into their new position. "You're adapting to this situation better than some infantry soldiers I've known. Keep up that fire discipline and target selection." From their new position, Maria could see the entire battlefield more clearly. The Taliban had positioned fighters in at least 5 different locations, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered most of the village center. Their tactics were sophisticated, with coordinated movements and mutually supporting positions that spoke to significant training and preparation. She continued engaging targets as they presented themselves, her confidence growing with each successful shot. The rifle felt like a natural extension of her body now, and she found herself automatically adjusting for range and wind without conscious thought. The emergency medicine training had taught her to function under extreme stress, and those skills were transferring to combat surprisingly well. Private Johnson's voice came over the radio with increasing urgency. "I'm down to my last magazine. We need that air support now." Similar reports came from other positions around the perimeter, confirming that the patrol's ammunition situation was becoming critical. Maria checked her own supply and found that she had already expended 2 magazines, leaving her with just 3 more plus Morrison's remaining ammunition. The distinctive sound of rotor blades finally became audible over the gunfire, growing steadily louder as the Apache gunships approached their location. Maria felt a surge of relief knowing that help was finally arriving, but also knew that they still had to survive the next few minutes while the aircraft identified targets and prepared to engage. "All stations, mark your positions with smoke," Morrison commanded over the radio. "Friendly air inbound. Danger close. Mark all known enemy positions with red smoke if possible." Green smoke began rising from the patrol's positions around the village perimeter, clearly identifying their locations for the incoming aircraft. Maria could see soldiers throwing smoke grenades to mark Taliban positions as well, the red smoke creating distinct targets for the gunship crews to engage. The first Apache appeared low over the ridgeline, its pilot immediately identifying the tactical situation and beginning to acquire targets. The 30mm cannon beneath the aircraft's nose began tracking toward the largest enemy position, and Maria knew that the tide of battle was about to change dramatically. As the Apache prepared to engage, Maria continued providing covering fire for her fellow soldiers, while helping Morrison coordinate their defensive efforts. She had successfully transitioned from medical provider to combat soldier, proving that courage and training could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. The sound of the helicopter's weapons systems charging up filled the air, promising swift and decisive action against the insurgents who had trapped them in this deadly ambush. The Apache gunship's 30mm cannon erupted in a thunderous roar that drowned out all other sounds on the battlefield. The heavy rounds slammed into the hillside positions where the Taliban fighters had been concealed, sending up massive clouds of dust and debris. The precision of the air support was devastating, each burst of cannon fire eliminating entire enemy positions with surgical accuracy. Maria watched through her rifle scope as the insurgent fire immediately began to diminish. The psychological effect of the helicopter attack was as important as the physical damage, with surviving Taliban fighters abandoning their positions to seek cover deeper in the rocky terrain. She continued to scan for targets while the gunship worked methodically through the marked enemy positions. The second Apache arrived moments later, adding its firepower to the engagement. Together, the two aircraft systematically dismantled the ambush that had pinned down the patrol for nearly an hour. The coordinated attack demonstrated the overwhelming superiority that coalition forces could bring to bear when air support was available. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Morrison commanded over the radio as the last enemy position fell silent. "Let the birds work. All stations, prepare for casualty evacuation and ammunition resupply. We'll be moving out as soon as the area is secure." Maria lowered her rifle and immediately shifted back to her medical responsibilities. During the firefight, she had seen at least 2 soldiers take cover in positions that suggested they might be wounded. Her combat role had been necessary for survival, but her primary duty remained the care of injured personnel. She quickly moved to check on Private Johnson, who had been engaging targets from behind a damaged wall. As she approached his position, she could see that he was favoring his left leg and had blood seeping through his trousers. A bullet fragment or piece of shrapnel had apparently found its mark during the intense exchange of gunfire. "Johnson, let me take a look at that leg," Maria said, already reaching for her medical supplies. The soldier was pale and clearly in pain, but had continued fighting throughout the engagement despite his injury. His dedication exemplified the commitment that made these soldiers willing to risk everything for their fellow Americans. "It's not that bad, Doc," Johnson replied, though his voice betrayed the pain he was trying to conceal. "Just a piece of concrete that got kicked up by a bullet. Stings like crazy. But I don't think it hit anything important." Maria carefully examined the wound, finding a jagged piece of concrete embedded in the muscle of his upper thigh. The fragment was about 2 inches long and had penetrated deeply enough to cause significant bleeding, but had missed the major blood vessels and bone. It would require surgical removal, but wasn't immediately life-threatening. She applied a pressure bandage around the embedded fragment, being careful not to drive it deeper into the tissue. Military protocol dictated leaving foreign objects in place until surgical facilities were available, as removal in field conditions could cause additional damage or bleeding. Johnson would need immediate evacuation for proper medical care. "You did good today," Maria told him while securing the bandage. "Kept your head down and kept fighting, even after taking this hit. That's what brings everyone home safely." Moving quickly to the next position, Maria found Corporal Williams nursing a minor burn on his forearm from his overheated weapon barrel. The squad automatic weapon had been fired almost continuously during the engagement, and the metal surfaces had become hot enough to cause injury through direct contact. It was a relatively minor injury but still required attention to prevent infection. She cleaned the burn and applied a specialized dressing designed for thermal injuries. Williams would be able to continue his duties with minimal limitation, but would need to be more careful about weapon handling for the next few days. The injury served as a reminder of how even routine equipment could become dangerous during extended combat operations. Sergeant Rodriguez approached her position as she finished treating Williams. His uniform was torn and dirty, and she could see several small cuts on his exposed arms where flying debris had found its mark. Despite his appearance, he moved with the confidence of a soldier who had performed well under fire. "Gonzalez, you need to know that what you did today was exceptional," Rodriguez said, his voice serious despite his usual jovial nature. "I've been in combat for 3 tours, and I've never seen a medic transition to fighting like that. You saved the captain's life, and probably saved all of us by maintaining our rate of fire." Maria felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty about Rodriguez's praise. She had done what the situation required, but the experience of taking human life still weighed heavily on her conscience. The Taliban fighters she had engaged were trying to kill her fellow soldiers. But they were still human beings, with families and hopes of their own. "I just did my job," Maria replied, while checking Rodriguez's minor injuries. The captain needed medical attention, and then he needed someone to operate his weapon. The situation dictated my actions. "That's exactly the point," Rodriguez continued. "You recognized what the mission required and adapted without hesitation. Not everyone can make that transition when lives are on the line. The captain's alive because you were willing to step outside your normal role." The sound of additional helicopters announced the arrival of the evacuation aircraft that would transport the wounded soldiers back to base for advanced medical care. A UA-60 Black Hawk medical evacuation helicopter approached the landing zone that had been marked with colored smoke by the patrol members. Maria helped coordinate the loading of casualties, ensuring that Johnson received priority due to his penetrating wound, while making sure that Morrison was properly secured for transport, despite his protests about leaving his unit in the field. The captain wanted to remain with his soldiers, but his injuries required surgical intervention that was only available at the Combat Support Hospital. "Gonzalez, I want you to know that I'll be recommending you for recognition when we get back," Morrison said as the medical crew prepared him for evacuation. "What you accomplished today goes far beyond your normal duties as a medic. You exemplified the kind of courage and adaptability that makes the difference between mission success and failure." As the medical evacuation helicopter lifted off with the wounded soldiers, Maria reflected on the events of the day. She had joined the army to save lives through medical care, but had found herself taking lives to protect her fellow soldiers. The moral complexity of the situation would require time and reflection to fully process. The remaining patrol members began the process of securing the village and preparing for their return to base. The Apache gunships continued to provide overwatch from above, ensuring that no additional Taliban fighters attempted to engage the Americans during their vulnerable reorganization phase. Local villagers began to emerge from their shelters as the immediate danger passed, their faces showing a mixture of relief and concern about the violence that had erupted in their community. Maria could see children peering around doorways while their mothers kept them close, the universal parental instinct to protect their young transcending cultural and linguistic boundaries. The village elder who had requested the original meeting approached under a white flag carried by one of his younger relatives. His weathered face showed genuine distress about what had occurred, and he spoke urgently with the interpreter about his lack of knowledge regarding the planned ambush. "He says the Taliban came to the village 3 days ago and threatened the families," the interpreter explained to the acting patrol leader. "They forced the men to leave and set up their positions in the hills. The elder had no choice but to go through with the meeting as planned, knowing it was a trap." This revelation explained the absence of military-age males that Maria had noticed during their arrival. The Taliban had effectively used the civilian population as unwilling participants in their ambush, creating a situation where the villagers were caught between competing forces beyond their control. The patrol spent another 2 hours securing the area and conducting a thorough search for additional threats or intelligence materials. Maria used this time to treat minor injuries among the remaining soldiers and to begin processing her own emotional response to the combat experience. She had fired her weapon in anger for the first time, engaging enemy combatants in direct firefights that determined who lived and who died. The training scenarios and qualification exercises had not fully prepared her for the psychological impact of these life and death decisions. Each trigger pull had been necessary and justified, but the weight of those actions would stay with her long after returning home. During the helicopter flight back to Fob Phoenix, Maria sat quietly among her fellow soldiers, each of them dealing with their own thoughts about the day's events. The easy camaraderie that usually characterized these flights was replaced by the subdued reflection that often followed intense combat operations. Sergeant Rodriguez sat across from her in the cargo bay, occasionally catching her eye and nodding with approval and respect. The other soldiers looked at her differently now, too, with the recognition that she had proven herself under fire when the situation demanded it. She was no longer just the unit's medic, but a combat veteran who had earned her place among warriors. Back at the base, Maria immediately reported to the medical facility to check on Morrison and Johnson. Both soldiers were stable and receiving appropriate care, with Morrison already planning his return to duty despite doctor's orders for extended rest. The captain's determination to rejoin his unit demonstrated the leadership qualities that had earned the respect of his soldiers. "How are you holding up?" Morrison asked when Maria entered his hospital room. His arm was properly splinted and immobilized, but his eyes remained alert and focused on the welfare of his troops. The morphine had been reduced as his pain levels decreased, allowing him to think more clearly about the tactical lessons from their engagement. "I'm processing it, sir," Maria replied honestly. "Today was different from anything I expected when I became a medic. I'm proud that I was able to help. But I'm also trying to understand what it means for my future service." "Trying." Morrison studied her face carefully before responding. His experience as a combat leader had taught him to recognize the signs of post-combat stress and the importance of addressing psychological injuries with the same seriousness as physical wounds. "What you experience today is normal," Morrison said. "Every soldier who sees combat goes through this process of reconciling their actions with their values. The fact that you're thinking about these questions shows that you're processing the experience in a healthy way. Don't let anyone tell you that doubting or questioning makes you weak." Over the following weeks, Maria found herself changed by the combat experience in ways both subtle and profound. Her confidence in high-stress situations increased dramatically, and she approached medical emergencies with the same calm competence she had displayed during the firefight. The other soldiers in the unit treated her with a new level of respect and trust. The official recognition came 6 weeks later, during a ceremony attended by senior officers from brigade headquarters. Maria received the Combat Medical Badge, acknowledging her role in providing medical care under enemy fire. But more significantly, she was awarded the Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor in combat. The citation read in part, "Sergeant Gonzalez displayed exceptional courage and adaptability when her unit came under intense enemy fire. After treating her wounded commanding officer under direct fire, she immediately transitioned to combat operations, effectively engaging multiple enemy positions and contributing significantly to the patrol's successful defense. Her actions exemplify the highest standards of military service and battlefield excellence." Standing at attention during the award ceremony, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had enlisted to save lives through medical care, and had discovered that sometimes saving lives required taking them. The moral complexity of that reality would continue to challenge her, but she had proven to herself and others that she possessed the courage and skill necessary for both roles. The experience had transformed her understanding of military service and her place within the broader mission. She was no longer just a medic who happened to carry a rifle, but a complete soldier capable of adapting to whatever challenges the mission might require. This knowledge would shape the remainder of her deployment and her future military career. As the ceremony concluded and she returned to her regular duties, Maria carried with her the satisfaction of knowing she had made her mark when it mattered most. In the space of a single afternoon, she had saved her commanding officer's life, helped defend her unit against overwhelming odds, and earned recognition as both a skilled medical professional and a capable combat soldier. The medals and citations were meaningful symbols of recognition, but the true measure of her success was simpler and more profound. Every soldier in her unit had returned home alive. That knowledge, more than any formal award, validated the choices she had made and the courage she had found within herself when her fellow Americans needed it most. Her story would become part of the unit's legend, told and retold to new soldiers as an example of how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when duty and honor demanded it. Maria had proven that heroism came not from seeking glory, but from doing whatever was necessary to protect those who depended on her skill and courage.